Viruses and worms are perhaps the most popular types of malware that we know. So a virus basically infects applications and files by inserting itself in their code. An important point to remember is that viruses, they always require the infected application or the file to be executed, which means that they cannot run on their own. So they need the user to actually open the file or run an executable in order to trigger their action. Virus has two main functions. The first is replication. It basically reproduces itself exponentially. So if you open a, let's say, virus infected file, it is not going to create another virus infected file. It may create hundreds of them. So that expansion is exponential, not linear. Second function of a virus is to cause destruction, which can be through corruption of data, files, or applications. Now, viruses are used for multiple purposes. Sometimes they're used to steal your data. Sometimes they can lead to ransomware or denial of service attacks. So basically, imagine if a virus infects your web application server and it causes it to shut down or become corrupt, then your application would no longer be able to service the clients around the world. So that would be a denial of service attack. Or a virus may lead to a ransomware attack in which your important files or databases are encrypted, and then you have to pay a ransom to get them decrypted. In contrast to popular opinion, viruses are not always created with a malicious intent. Some viruses are created just for fun. They're just to annoy the end users. Let me share a small story. Back in the 1990s, when I was in high school, I had recently learned how to write batch programs. So basically, batch files are executable files. You just put a series of commands in them, and when you execute the file, those commands are executed. Seems pretty simple now, but it was something interesting back then. So basically, I shared the game Prince of Persia with one of my friends, and I replaced the prince.exe file with prince.batch file, which basically had some commands which made all the files hidden in the directory, and it displayed that your system has been hacked. It was a benign ploy, but it was really fun. So to reiterate, viruses are not always there to cause damage, and they're not always created with malicious intent. Sometimes the viruses are just there to annoy you. So viruses come in different types and flavors. So the first type is a boot sector virus, which basically infects the boot sector so that the virus is always loaded. Now remember, the boot sector is a special partition in your hard disk which manages the booting process. So whenever your system boots, it is this part of your hard disk which loads the operating system, including the kernel, firmware, and other applications. So if a virus infects this sector, it means that even if you remove it from your applications or other parts of your hard disk, it would always be loaded. The next is macro virus. Now this virus infects Microsoft Office documents and spreadsheets. Basically, Microsoft Excel sheets and Word documents, they have macros, which are basically automated scripts which automate some of your repetitive tasks, especially when you're working on spreadsheets, etc. So this virus infects those macros. We have a stealth virus as well, which basically operates in the stealth mode, which means hidden mode. It tries to hide itself from the antivirus software, and it does some really neat tricks. So for instance, sometimes when the antivirus tries to scan a file, it just temporarily removes itself from that file and then comes back later on. So the next are polymorphic viruses. Now these viruses change their form, and by form we mean their code. So interestingly, these are viruses which change their own code dynamically. So basically they change some segments of the code, obviously not all of the code. But the basic purpose is that if there is an antivirus system which is trying to catch this virus or detect this virus through some particular signatures, then the virus changes its code so that its signature changes so that it can evade detection. And then we have encrypted virus itself, which basically leverages the power of encryption to hide itself. So imagine if a virus is encrypted and you don't have the decryption key and you don't have the decryption algorithms, then how would you know if it is a virus or not? Because you won't be able to decode it, to decrypt it, so you won't be able to analyze it. So let's start with the boot sector virus. So the boot sector virus infects the MBR, which is the master boot record of the hard disk. It alters the boot sequence to ensure that whenever your system is booted, the virus always gets loaded. In contrast to their ominous sounding name, they're usually easier to detect and remove. Now let's see how the normal boot process works. So you always have a bootloader which basically loads the OS kernel. Now remember, kernel is a part of your operating system which is always loaded in the memory. You can consider it as the brain of your operating system because operating system is really huge. It contains a lot of stuff, it contains a lot of drivers, firmwares, and so on. But the core of the operating system, the brain of the operating system, is the kernel, which is always there in the memory. But if your system is infected, then it would be the virus which would load first, then it would load the bootloader, which would subsequently call the OS kernel. So basically, it changes the boot sequence in order to ensure that it is always loaded. So next are macro viruses. So Microsoft Word and Excel, they use script functions for repetitive tasks. Whenever you work on a spreadsheet, there are several tasks that you need to be done automatically. For that, they use script functions. Now, script functions are typically implemented using Visual Basic, and the basic aim, as we discussed, is automating tasks. Now, macro viruses infect these script functions for malicious purposes. The damage potential, however, is a bit limited because whenever you need to run a macro, it requires explicit user permission. So whenever you're working on spreadsheets, for example, if you need to use a macro, the system pops up a dialog and explicitly asks you whether you want to run this macro or not. So that's why the damage potential is somewhat limited because user permission is explicitly required. So next are stealth viruses. Stealth viruses always operate in stealth mode or the hidden mode. They use a number of techniques to evade detection. So for example, they continually rename themselves. So if there is an antivirus which is doing detection based on names, then they can evade them. Although very few antiviruses use just names, they use signatures or the patterns of code within the file. Another technique is to move around in the disk. So for example, by changing their location, they try to evade detection. Stealth virus techniques are not just limited to renaming themselves or moving around in the disk. They sometimes change operating processes to evade detection by the antivirus. So this is a more sophisticated technique that they sometimes employ. Let's see how this works. So whenever the antivirus is scanning your system, what it is doing in the background is that it sends a request to the operating system to access a certain file, and the operating system in turn requests the disk manager to actually fetch that file. So this is how normally things work. But when you have a stealth virus, what it does is that whenever the antivirus requests access to the infected file, instead of sending the infected file, the stealth virus sends the clean file. So instead of this infected file, the antivirus is going to receive this clean file. And that's how the stealth virus would be able to evade detection by modifying the operating system processes. So next are worms. Sometimes people confuse viruses and worms, but there are some key differences. So for example, unlike viruses, the worms, they do not attach themselves to a specific application. If you recall, we discussed that virus always infects specific files or executables, and it inserts itself into the code of that file so that whenever that file is opened or executed, the virus gets triggered and comes into action. But unlike viruses, the worms are auto-triggered. They do not need the user to actually open or execute a file. Now worms, they replicate and propagate independently. Their main attack vector is network propagation. So basically the main aim of worms is to propagate exponentially, so much so that they choke networks, they choke bandwidth, and they bring down complete networks. A famous worm is the MyDoom worm, which was released in 2004. It holds the record for the fastest spreading email-based worm. It infected Microsoft operating systems. The basic purpose of this worm was to infect computers so that spammers could send spam emails through the infected computers. So this worm basically opened backdoors in the systems, which provided for further access to the remote hacker. An interesting thing about the MyDoom worm was that it even attacked IT giants like Microsoft and Google with distributed denial of service attacks. It caused a significant amount of damage all around the world, and it was estimated that it caused a total of $38 billion damage. Now that's a significant damage. So whenever you read a news about a famous computer virus wreaking havoc, usually what they're referring to are worms. Because viruses are usually contained to the system that they have infected. They don't propagate that easily. On the other hand, worms are primarily designed to propagate extensively over the network. So typically, for example, in the case of the MyDoom worm, what it did was that once a system was infected, the virus would attach itself to emails and send itself to all the contacts of that person. So this way, the spread was exponential. It infected millions of systems around the world and caused significant damage. So that concludes our lecture. I'll see you in the next lecture.